What's something you wish your family would just admit already?
I can still hear the sound of crystal glasses clinking against each other, the fake laughter echoing off the high ceiling, and the heavy perfume of roses filling the air so thickly it almost felt like it was choking me. My mother, Marjorie, had planned her birthday party as if she were the queen of some dynasty, parading herself in a floor-length gown and demanding that everyone stand up when she entered the room, as though we had gathered for a coronation rather than a simple family celebration. The irony was that this wasn't a celebration at all, at least not for me. It was a stage, her stage, where she had chosen to play out her favorite role, the ruthless matriarch who enjoyed reminding everyone that power only belonged to her. I knew something was coming long before she called for silence. She had that look on her face, the one I had learned to recognize since childhood, where her smile stretched too wide, her chin lifted too high, and her eyes scanned the room not to connect but to measure. My brother Daniel, the ever-perfect son, already had his hand resting smugly on the back of her chair, as if he had rehearsed his role in the performance. Relatives leaned in, curious and hungry for gossip, because in families like mine, humiliation was always served best when everyone had a front-row seat. When she finally tapped her glass with a fork, the room hushed. I braced myself. Her speeches never ended without someone being cut open, and tonight I knew it was my turn. She cleared her throat, announced how grateful she was to see everyone gathered to celebrate another year of life, and then pivoted with the sharpness of a knife, her tone flattening as she turned toward me. She said my name slowly, like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence, and then with a theatrical pause she declared, "As of today, I have updated my will, and I want you all to know that my daughter will not be included in it." The air cracked in half. I felt dozens of eyes shoot toward me, some wide with shock, others gleaming with quiet satisfaction, and a few whispering behind hands like they had just been handed a piece of juicy gossip. Daniel's smirk spread across his face like butter melting on hot bread, and I could see him leaning back in his chair, basking in the glow of his official coronation as the sole heir. My mother wasn't done, though. She added a flourish, saying she had made this choice because I had chosen a life of disobedience and disrespect, words that dripped with venom disguised as dignity. For a second, I let the silence hang because I knew everyone expected me to crack. They wanted tears, an outburst, maybe even me storming out of the room to prove her right. That's how my mother set her traps. She believed if she embarrassed me in public, I would break in public too. But instead, I smiled. I didn't just fake a smile. I gave her the kind of calm, unsettling smile that made a few people shift uncomfortably in their seats. I could feel the tension ripple through the room, confusion replacing the smugness as I lifted my glass and said, "That doesn't matter anymore." The words landed like stones, heavy and sharp. People blinked, waiting for me to explain, to show the crack in the armor. My mother's face froze, her carefully applied smile faltering for just a moment. And then, still smiling, I added, because I already wrote a different ending. You could have heard a pin drop. Relatives leaned forward, brows furrowed, as if they were suddenly unsure of who was holding the power. Daniel's smirk twitched into something closer to a frown, because even in his arrogance, he recognized I wasn't bluffing. My mother's hands, usually steady when she was in command, tapped ever so slightly against the tablecloth, betraying that she was no longer as comfortable as she had been moments ago. Inside, I felt an almost electric calm. I had been waiting for this moment for years, knowing she would never be able to resist humiliating me when she thought she had the upper hand. And I knew the only way to take that power back wasn't by screaming or crying or begging. It was by smiling in her face and letting her, and everyone else in the room, know that the story she thought she was writing had already been rewritten. By me. I let my glass rest on the table without taking a sip and leaned back in my chair as though nothing had been said at all. Conversations restarted hesitantly, like people weren't sure if it was safe to break the silence, but I caught their eyes, those cousins, aunts, and neighbors, lingering on me longer than they had ever dared before. They were unsettled, because for the first time in years, my mother hadn't delivered the final word. The truth was, I had been preparing for this exact night, for this exact humiliation, and while my mother thought she had stripped me of everything, she had no idea what I had already secured. She had no idea that her little performance was nothing more than background noise to a plan already set in motion. And as she tried to regain her poise, raising her voice to shift attention back to her birthday, I simply sat there, smiling like someone who already knew the ending to a story everyone else had just begun to read. Because while she was busy celebrating her power, I had already decided it was time to take it away from her. And by the time she realized what I had done, the last laugh would be mine. When the room finally remembered how to breathe and the band slid into a safe melody my mother could hum to, I excused myself with the same polite smile I used on difficult clients and migraine headaches. And as I crossed the hallway lined with framed portraits where Marjorie's face aged like a museum exhibit of herself, I realized that this was not the first corridor I had walked while pretending to be smaller so she could feel larger. Because my childhood had been an endless set of hallways that funneled every compliment toward Daniel and every correction toward me, a domestic conveyor belt where she sorted worth like a factory line and stamped me with almost. I remember report cards spread on the kitchen table like evidence in a trial, where an A- was treated as a confession and Daniel's B magically meant leadership potential. And the way she dressed me for school as if life were an audition for a part she had already assigned to someone else, all while telling neighbors at block parties that I was bookish in a cute way, a sugar-coated dismissal that stuck to my ribs longer than any insult. And I learned to sharpen my tongue into humor, because it was the only weapon that didn't draw blood but still left a mark. Money was her favorite leash, braided out of favors, threats, and carefully timed gifts, and she taught us early that gratitude meant obedience while independence meant disrespect. So when I left home after college and paid rent on a moldy apartment with thin walls and kinder silence, I did it with a stubborn pride that tasted like copper, telling myself I would never again owe her anything except the bare minimum of civility, which, for Marjorie, felt like treason. She responded by upgrading Daniel's car for safety and sending me a scented card advising that bad attitudes are expensive, a line so perfectly her that I laughed until I cried, and then found a second job. People like to believe mothers cannot be villains because it breaks a story they want to tell themselves about goodness being inevitable, yet Marjorie never hid her preferences and never apologized for the way she wielded attention like spotlight and noose. And if I am being honest, which I promised myself I would be, even when it makes you judge me, I grew into a woman who could read a room better than a sermon, and who sometimes chose the difficult truth because it sounded cleaner than forgiveness, which is exactly why, when the humiliation announcement arrived tonight like a special, hand-delivered package, I was neither surprised nor frightened, only focused, because the last few years I had done something she considered unthinkable. I built my own leverage. It started small and almost accidental, a friendly favor to a neighbor on our street named Lila, whose mother had once co-owned a sliver of land with my grandfather. While Daniel was busy golfing his way into imaginary ventures and my mother was performing magnanimity at charity luncheons, I was helping Lila untangle paperwork that should have been routine but turned into a treasure map drawn by a drunk surveyor. And what I found, after months of patient calls and public records that smelled like dust and ink, was that a portion of the property everyone assumed belonged to Marjorie had been quietly misfiled, not stolen and not dramatic, just misfiled in a way that placed control in a neglected trust my grandfather had created for whichever grandchild maintained stewardship, a quaint phrase that meant nothing to my mother because it required responsibility and everything to me because it required attention. I visited the county clerk's office so many times the security guard started saving me a place in line, and I hired a lawyer who did not flinch around wealthy donors because she had been raised by a waitress and a mechanic and had no patience for porcelain egos. And together we cleaned the mess, filed the corrections, and activated the trust with the sort of quiet precision that makes some people yawn, but makes me feel like a locksmith opening a door that has waited years to turn, and when it clicked, I became the steward by the simplest clause in the whole file, the only grandchild who had done the work. So when Marjorie theatrically cut me out of the will tonight, I did not flinch because I already owned the key to the gate everyone assumed she controlled. It is not flashy wealth and it will not buy a yacht, but it is the piece of ground beneath her favorite project. The boutique expansion she brags about between appetizers, the one Daniel calls their legacy footprint, and the lease they need runs through me, through my signature, through the woman she believes can be erased with a speech. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good, because I used to think revenge had to be loud to count, and now I know it can be a clause, a date, a line that says renewal at my discretion. After a full glass of water and a very long stare at my reflection, I returned to the party and thanked my mother for the lovely evening with a voice so pleasant it almost made me blush. Then I asked Daniel, with sweetness that could rot a tooth, whether he had chosen the tile for the new location yet, and when he puffed up and bragged about Moroccan patterns and brand continuity, I nodded like a supportive sister and said, almost lazily, that permitting teams can be so unpredictable when a leaseholder decides to pause, not cancel, just pause, a tiny word with very long legs, and to his credit, he laughed at first before noticing that I was not laughing with him. I did not raise my voice, and I did not make a scene. I simply let him understand, in a low and patient tone, that the expansion timetable everyone had been crowing about all summer now hinged on me requesting nothing more than additional time to review some environmental questions, all perfectly legal and perfectly boring. And his face went the color of old marble as he realized that their victory lap had been scheduled on a track I owned, and while you might wish I had taken the higher road, I have spent a lifetime circling her mountain, so tonight I chose to plant a flag instead. The band swelled for the cake procession, and someone started a chorus of forced delight, but the only sound I cared about was the small exhale my mother could not quite hide when she saw me standing beside Daniel, smiling the way polite women smile when they intend to rearrange the furniture, because for the first time she understood I was not bluffing. The will could exclude me, the room could judge me, and the gossip could hang me out to dry. Yet the ground beneath her plan had been nailed to my name with filings she never bothered to read, and while she searched my face for a plea, I offered her something more unsettling than tears. I offered patience, and the promise that tomorrow morning the contractor would receive a carefully worded notice from the steward of the trust, which is to say from me, marked urgent. By the time the last candle smear had been scrubbed from the dessert plates and the rented glassware clacked into their bins like tidy little verdicts, the machinery I had set in motion had already begun its quiet turning. Because while my mother enjoyed lingering at the center of the final toasts, soaking in the applause that always followed her grand pronouncements, I stepped outside under the sagging string lights with my phone and a voice that could pass for cordial even when I was handing someone a headache, and I dictated a concise, impeccably polite notice to the contractor reminding them that pursuant to the stewardship clause and the lease addendum, all site work would pause pending additional environmental review on stormwater mitigation, which is not the sort of phrase that wins you friends at family parties, yet it has a way of rearranging schedules, tightening budgets, and waking bankers who believed their collateral would stay exactly where they left it. I slept that night with the kind of rest that feels like a decision well kept, and in the morning I drove to a coffee shop where the owner lets me linger without buying a second cup because I once helped her decode a miserable sales tax letter. And there I met Ms. Patel, the bank liaison my mother treats like a concierge, but who, in reality, answers to risk committees rather than birthday queens. I laid out a neat folder with the lease pause, the stewardship documents, and a list of items flagged by a friendly engineer who owed me precisely nothing except the satisfaction of correcting people who treat regulations like suggestions. And as Ms. Patel scanned the pages with the serene skepticism of someone who has seen empires dissolve over parking lot runoff, she nodded slowly and said the sentence I had been waiting to hear since last night, which was that loan disbursements tied to the expansion would automatically enter a review hold until the leaseholder confirmed continuity. And since the leaseholder was me, a hold was exactly what they had. Daniel called before lunch with the strained brightness of a man performing optimism for an audience of one, assuring me that everything could be resolved with a quick conversation and a sensible sister-to-brother understanding. And I let him talk because his confidence has always been a sort of lullaby to himself, Then I asked a single question about the covenant requiring uninterrupted access to the site, which of course the pause compromised, which of course the bank would now care about in a very expensive way, and he tried to pivot into charm the way people pivot into dance steps they have practiced in a mirror, only to find the music has changed. So I told him, calmly and almost kindly, that this was not personal, it was procedural. Although between us we both knew that was only half the truth, because procedure can be a scalpel when you have steady hands. News travels inside families like a draft sneaking under doors, and by afternoon I had 3 messages that sounded like sympathy from people who had never risked a kind word when I actually needed one, plus a text from my aunt who asked for coffee and then, after exactly 1 minute of pleasantries, wondered whether a small stipend might help me soften my stance for the greater good, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the choreography was so familiar, the bribe dressed as concern, the concern wrapped in guilt, and I told her that process would decide the timeline now, not stipends, not promises, and certainly not guilt. After which she pivoted with athletic speed into the myth that women who assert boundaries must be angry or unwell, a myth I allowed to land on the floor without a home. In the late afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the expansion site with Lila, who knows more about local politics than any glossy consultant my mother retains, and we discussed practicalities that never appear in ribbon-cutting speeches, like storm drains that back up when the river sulks, like school traffic that turns intersections into parking lots, like neighbors who find their inner activist when trucks idle at dawn, and together we drafted the most devastatingly boring email to the planning department you could imagine, an email that weaponized tedium, that stacked patient questions upon documented concerns, that cited policy with the affection of librarians. And though it contained not a single insult, it carried the weight of 1,000 signatures because it was correct, and correctness, when applied with steady pressure, is a quiet wrecking ball. My mother did not call, she summoned, which is her preferred method of communication, and I went, not because I answer summonses, but because it delights me to arrive on my own terms, and when I stepped into her kitchen that evening, the light slicing through the blinds onto her spotless counters like the stripes of a flag she believed belonged only to her, she greeted me with a smile that trembled at the edges, poured tea she did not touch, and tried a new script in which she was merely a concerned elder trying to protect a legacy from my impulsive decisions, at which point I set the stewardship documents on the table, turned them so they faced her, and explained in a voice stripped of drama that the pause would remain until my conditions were met: transparency on project finances, removal of Daniel from operational control until the bank concluded its review, and a written apology for the public theatrics masquerading as a will disclosure, not because I needed her contrition to breathe, but because accountability must begin somewhere, and tonight it would begin at her own table. Her eyes hardened the way glass hardens under flame, and she slid an envelope across the table with the casual menace of someone dealing a final card, saying she had anticipated my little stewardship play and had prepared a document that would, at minimum, make my position significantly more complicated, because while I had been busy researching trusts and leases, she had been busy researching me, and the envelope, sealed, heavy, and addressed in a crisp hand that was not hers, sat between us, like a small, sleeping animal that might, at any second, decide to bite. The envelope was heavier than it looked, weighted not by paper but by the theater she hoped to stage with it, and when I slid it open across the kitchen island where she photographs holiday centerpieces as if floral foam were a personality, I found a demand letter printed on expensive stock from a boutique firm that sells intimidation by the ounce, accusing me, with admirable confidence and several Latin phrases, of breaching a fiduciary duty I had read enough times to recite in my sleep. Their argument hinging on the notion that a steward must act for the benefit of all beneficiaries and not to satisfy personal grievances, which, to their credit, is true in the abstract, but less convincing when the steward's request for transparency and risk controls protects the asset from a hurry-up-and-pray construction schedule. And even less convincing when the letter's exhibits were screenshots of emails I allegedly sent declining an annual filing I had filed at 8 in the morning with a digital timestamp, and an efficiently bored clerk who stamped the receipt so hard the seal embossing is practically a sculpture. My mother watched me read, sipping tea she did not enjoy, the way some people chew ice to make a point, and when I placed the packet back in its envelope, she smiled in that way that has sold 1,000 myths to 1,000 cousins, telling me she had already scheduled a hearing to question my suitability as steward, that a judge would quickly recognize spite when she saw it, and that the court of family opinion had already returned a preliminary verdict, at which I laughed, not because the situation was funny, but because she still believed the mirror she carries is a courtroom, and then I pulled from my bag the least glamorous object in the world, a stapled stack of municipal filings marked received, paired with the bank liaison's notice of a routine hold triggered by my lease pause, and I set them down with the care of someone plating dessert, after which I added a second stack, this one thinner and far more combustible. A report prepared by an accountant with a talent for tracing money through parties that call themselves unrelated while sharing a last name at the dinner table, identifying a consulting retainer paid to Daniel's shell venture out of pre-disbursement funds, a payment small enough to be dismissed in conversation and large enough to irritate an underwriter, especially when the engagement letter carried no deliverables, only adjectives. Her eyes flickered, not with fear so much as with recognition that the narrative had wandered off her script, and I told her, in a voice that could pass for gentle if you were not listening closely, that I had already transmitted the report to the bank's risk team and, because sunlight is not a sin, to the non-profit board that had pledged a naming gift to the expansion. A board whose chairwoman once hugged me in a parking lot and whispered that she admires women who can stand up without setting themselves on fire, and while my mother composed her spine into something regal, I let the next sentence settle between us, that as steward I was issuing, effective immediately, a notice to cure for unapproved related party transfers and for site activity undertaken prior to fully executed environmental clearance, a technical pair of taps on the brakes that translate, in project language, to lost weeks, shredded timelines, and phone calls that begin with the phrase about the covenants. She slid to anger the way some people slide into a silk robe, elegant and practiced, and suggested that I had overplayed my hand, because courts dislike cleverness in women and banks dislike delays, and donors dislike drama unless they sponsor it. Then, lowering her voice into something approximating maternal concern, she added that she would be happy to resolve all of this privately if I would simply rescind the pause, sign the consent Daniel had requested, and accept a personal accommodation in the form of a discretionary bequest to be discussed at a later date, which is the kind of offer that sounds like reconciliation in a greeting card and extortion in daylight. So I declined with the kind of smile that caused her to set the teacup down too carefully, and I explained, with the patience of a school crossing guard on a windy day, that my conditions remained unchanged and that my next step, already prepared, already queued, would be a filing with the planning department to review the traffic study assumptions. Her team massaged like bread dough, not accusatory, simply attentive, the way a thermostat is attentive when the room forgets to be honest about its temperature. Daniel stormed in at that exact moment, late to his own movie as usual, carrying the musk of golf cologne and certainty, announcing on command that my behavior was ungrateful, short-sighted, and borderline cruel, because every month of delay meant penalty fees and contractor attrition and a reputation cost his brand could not absorb, and he demanded I explain myself to him like a project manager presenting slides to an impatient prince, to which I replied that the only slide worth showing was the one where he accepted money from a project he is supposedly safeguarding, and that if he wished to discuss cruelty we might begin with the public theater of disinheritance staged by a woman who prefers audiences to outcomes, and that, in any case, the pause would hold until the beneficiaries had the financial clarity they deserve, and until I had an apology written in full sentences without the word if. I left the kitchen not triumphantly but correctly, which is a different sort of victory, and on my way out I forwarded the contractor the formal notice to suspend non-essential work and to secure the site per insurance guidelines, which is, incidentally, An exquisite form of revenge because it is impossible to rant about on social media without sounding like a person upset that basic compliance is inconvenient. Then, for good measure and a pinch of petty delight, I confirmed with the city that the ceremonial groundbreaking scheduled for the end of the month would require a revised permit given the hold, a revision the clerk promised to process at the speed of paper and patience, which is to say not at all quickly. And as I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Ms. Patel advising that, pending clarification regarding related party payments, the bank would pause all non-essential correspondence with my mother's team and would, for prudence, invite an external audit of pre-development expenditures. I was halfway down the block when my phone rang from an unfamiliar number, and the voice on the line, cool and efficient, introduced herself as counsel for the boutique firm whose letter I had admired for its typography, if not its logic, informing me that a petition had indeed been filed to challenge my stewardship and that a judge would see us within a week. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added that their petition included a sealed exhibit obtained through informal discovery concerning my professional licensure application from years ago, which, she said with the smugness of someone who enjoys cliff edges, might reflect an omission I would prefer not to discuss in open court. And as the call ended, I found myself staring at the horizon with the taste of copper in my mouth again, realizing that while I had aimed my leverage at the expansion, she had decided to aim hers at me. The licensure allegation arrived in court like a loaded whisper because the boutique firm had curled their petition around a sealed exhibit and a series of insinuations that depended on the judge confusing an administrative correction with a moral defect. Yet when my lawyer rose with the measured calm of someone who irons facts until they lie flat and reminded the court that the omission in my application had been self-reported the year it occurred, corrected within the statutory window, and blessed in writing by the very board now invoked as a cudgel, the polite smirk on opposing counsel's face evaporated in a twitch that would have been satisfying if I had been the sort of person who collected twitches. Though frankly I had come for something sturdier than schadenfreude, and I had brought it in a folder marked boring, because boring is where real leverage sleeps. I testified with the kind of detail that makes impatient people itch, laying out the stewardship clause, the timeline of filings, the bank's prudential hold, and the related party payment that had entered the project like a friendly rat, and while my mother sat 2 rows behind counsel with a posture that could splinter a broom handle, I chose not to glance at her because this was not a duel, it was a ledger, and ledgers reward attention rather than flair. By late afternoon the judge declined to remove me, ordered a temporary supervision arrangement that required monthly reporting, and suggested, with a dryness that bordered on humor, that family quarrels disguised as claims of fiduciary crisis tend to resolve when sunlight enters the room, which is exactly the forecast I had been engineering. I would love to say that winning in court felt like a hug, yet the relief tasted more like tap water after a storm, service restored, but the pipes still complaining, and because I had promised myself that revenge would be more than a pause button dressed as virtue, I drove not to the site or the bank, but to the small office of the nonprofit whose naming gift had hovered over the expansion like a halo, where the chairwoman listened without blinking as I traced the story from the birthday microphone to the boutique letterhead, then placed on her desk a pre-drafted amendment to the pledge agreement that converted their donation from a building naming gift into a program endowment contingent on governance standards that excluded any executive with unresolved conflicts. A change they were free to refuse with no rancor from me, yet a change that, if accepted, would turn a ribbon-cutting into a scholarship engine and a vanity monument into a service, and when she asked why I was offering them ammunition that might, incidentally, wound my own mother's favorite mirror, I told her the truth that sounded like betrayal only to people who worship optics, which is that legacies worth a plaque are built on outcomes that outlast the plaque. The board accepted by unanimous vote 2 days later, which meant that, even if the expansion survived its pause, the glittering promise of my mother's name etched across a facade would be replaced with a quiet sentence on a brochure describing an endowment to train first-generation entrepreneurs in the stubborn art of financial literacy. And for the first time since the party, I slept not like a general guarding a bridge, but like a woman who had chosen the bridge she was willing to defend. Daniel. called me at dawn to spit out a slurry of anger, boasting, and wounded math, and when he demanded to know whether I felt proud ruining a family achievement, I answered that pride had nothing to do with it because I had traded a stage for a system and a photo op for a runway, after which he hung up with a noise that might have been a curse or a swallowed plea. And I will admit that for a long minute I sat in the quiet and wondered whether I had pressed too hard on the glass. My mother did not wait long, because spectacle is the air she breathes, and she arrived at my door in a coat better suited for fundraisers than apologies, asking first for decency, then for mercy, and eventually for terms, which I gave her in a single sentence that contained more tenderness than she will ever admit and more steel than I will ever apologize for. A written apology for the public will announcement without the weasel of conditional language. A permanent removal of Daniel from financial control across every entity tied to the expansion, and a private letter to the board endorsing the endowment amendment as her idea, not because I wanted credit, but because I wanted her to learn the choreography of a step she had never danced. The step where power kneels to consequence and the room does not applaud. She studied my face as if searching for a hidden trap, then asked whether, if she agreed, I would restore the timeline, release the pause, and return to the family I had offended. By defending myself, and I told her that releases are not miracles, they are processes, and that while I would cooperate in good faith, there were some doors I would not re-enter, including the one where my worth was weighed against party favors. Because the different ending I wrote did not include a scene where I beg for another invitation to a table that serves humiliation as dessert. A week later, a courier delivered 2 envelopes, one addressed to me in the tidy handwriting of a woman who rehearses sincerity, the other to the board in a hand I recognized as the assistant's. I read the first without joy and without gloating, because the apology was not a hug and not even a confession, only a recognition written in complete sentences, which was enough for the ledger if not for the heart, and I forwarded the second without commentary, which altered a future photograph in a way cameras do not understand. In the months that followed, the site crept forward under supervision that felt like adult supervision. The bank signed checks that sounded like conditions being respected, and the scholarship applications began to arrive with handwriting that made me want to bake bread for strangers. Sometimes, on nights when the river sulks and the traffic hums like old neon, I wonder if my different ending was a victory or simply a rerouting, and whether I chose justice or a prettier form of control. And I suppose the ambiguity is the point, because the story my mother tried to write ended with a cut, while the one I wrote ends with a hinge, which means the door opens, though I still decide who walks through.